The economic risks of climate change I like to think of in terms of bookends, where you've got the local risks and the local impacts, and then the national or macro. So the local ones are basically what you read about in the newspaper. You read about houses getting flooded, or farmers affected by drought, or a storm blowing down schools and clinics. I mean, these are all local extreme events. But the economic risks are not just the buildings, the lost income, the people who are sick or even killed. Those are incredibly important. But there's also the macro risks, which are when you add up what happens to the economy, to jobs, to budget, what the country has to spend on, but maybe the revenue sources. What happens to trade? And with trade, the exchange rate. What happens to the financial sector that's exposed? So we also have these macro risks, and we call those macro critical risks. And I like to think in terms of both. So taking the idea I just mentioned of bookends, when we talk about budgeting and planning, we also need to tackle it top-down and tackle it bottom-up. We certainly here at WRI believe a lot in locally led adaptation, where cities and communities, they know best what they need to do. So their voice should be part of the planning process. But they don't always have the money. In fact, they rarely do. So the top-down planning and budgeting process involves national governments who have to allocate budget, but also have to work with the local authorities on managing money, transparency, accountability. Otherwise, people don't know what's happened. But also the national authorities can help access money, not just through national revenues and taxes, but also access in the international world of, it's a crazy world, but it's a big world of climate finance, of donors, climate funds, even private sector bond issues, et cetera. So the national government is central to accessing both the international and working down with local communities to address adaptation. Well, when we talk about climate risks, we often use the word mainstreaming. What does mainstreaming mean? Climate risks are everywhere. If you think of an economy and government as well, divided by sectors, it affects agriculture, it affects water, it affects health, it affects public works and infrastructure, it affects the macroeconomy, as I said. So we have to look across all these different sectors, but we also have to look, and not only the sectors, but then the government ministries that address those various sectors. National government, subnational government. So this is all part of the planning process. Now, when you think of planning itself, there's the physical planning side, which is what do we do? How do we tackle floods? How do we tackle storms? How do we tackle droughts? What do we do? How do we set priorities? And then you have to get to the economic and financial side. How much is it going to cost? How do we pay for it? How do we know if we get value for money? What comes first? We can't predict the future, so what are we fairly confident about, and what should we perhaps wait because it's more uncertain? So all these aspects in the planning process, physical, financial, economic, come together. And I mentioned the word mainstreaming. Not one group can do it. It's a matrix, it's a group effort. But finally, somebody has to make decisions. Who's that? Well, we all know the budget matters. So whoever controls the budget also controls where resources go and where action can take place. On planning, when it comes to the economics and finance of addressing climate risk, we have a lot of experience and a lot of studies that show this is money well spent, that there's good rates of return. What's another way of saying that? That money spent today is cheaper than the losses you will have in the future. And so, it's good to keep that in mind and to use planning tools that look at the time horizon of the planning that you're doing. Today, maybe 2025, maybe 2030, but if it's infrastructure, 2050. You have to look forward to really understand the benefits of what you're doing. Asking about the role of all the various actors I've just mentioned, there's many. So then I think is really interesting and really important because it's not just, the technical side, it's not just the economics, it's also about the institutions themselves and their capacity. So when we talk about the roles of people, you shouldn't do projects where there isn't the capacity to deliver. You shouldn't do projects if there isn't local ownership. You shouldn't do projects where there isn't some political support, because all these sort of political, social issues really come to play, not just in the planning process, but in the implementation process. And of course, when you're doing planning, you want to understand that. You want to know that what you're planning is likely to happen, to be done well, to be done as intended, and hopefully at the end of the process you can show the impact that you always hope for. So I'm a big believer that work with the institutions, build capacity to implement and own projects, in addition to just do the technical side of planning, which it's important, but it's not enough. So climate change is one of the most complicated issues that we've had to face, in the 21st century. Not only because it's scientifically complicated, but it's also highly uncertain. In every step of the way, you can identify what's the uncertainty. We don't know what the level of emissions are going to be. But even if we did know, we don't know what the impact of that level of emissions will be on rain and temperature and storms and air quality, etc. And even if we did know what the impact of those impacts were on rain and storms and land and coastal areas, we don't know what the human response will be, or what the damages will be, or the preparation, or the risk tolerance, or where people are even living or locating themselves. So there's so many uncertainties along the way that one of the challenges is to balance what we know today with what we think we know tomorrow, with what we may or may not know tomorrow, and what we know we actually have no idea about tomorrow. And what is tomorrow, by the way? Is it 2030? Is it 2040, 2050? The longer you go out, the more uncertainty there is. So fortunately, we do have tools to manage uncertainty, and those tools are to address things that are particularly urgent, particularly strong local and political ownership, and they can't wait. But anything that can wait a little bit, maybe we wait, because next year we'll have better information, better knowledge about the climate side, and maybe even better technology on the investment side. And so I'm never one to say we have to do it all now. We can't anyway. We don't have the money. We don't have the people. But to sequence what we do as part of the planning process, and I think we have to meet the challenge of uncertainty head on in that planning process. I would say extremely different. Here's why. In the world of mitigation, there's this concept of the social cost of carbon, which is for every ton of carbon emitted, how much damage is there to people, to nature, to the economy, to communities. And that number doesn't really matter whether that ton of carbon is emitted in Washington, D.C., or Dhaka, Bangladesh, or Shanghai, China. It doesn't matter. So the social cost of carbon is a very global measure of why we should be doing it. And that number, by the way, is going up constantly. People remember when the European market was $5 or $10 a ton. The Biden administration just came out and said, actually starting in 2020, we should be using the number of $190 a ton. And people are estimating it should be $500. So it's just going up. But on the mitigation side, it's a kind of a global measure. On the adaptation side, the impacts, as I said, are local. What does sea level rise, storms, temperature, what does it mean for the community of Dar es Salaam in Tanzania? What does it mean for a mountain community in Nepal? What does it mean for a farmer in Kansas, United States? All different, all local, all trends are becoming apparent, but the specifics are very different. And so we need metrics. We have an easy metric on the mitigation side, and we're still working on metrics on the adaptation side, which will help us set priorities and finance good adaptation responses.